Today, we're really going to dig into this book by Dr. Irving Kirsch, The Emperor's New Drugs. It's a really fascinating look at antidepressants, or more specifically, the myths surrounding antidepressants.
Yeah, what's so interesting about Kirsch's work is that he really digs into the data. I mean, he went straight to the source, even looked at all of the unpublished data submitted to the FDA.
Oh, wow. The stuff that doesn't usually see the light of day.
Exactly, and that's what makes his findings so compelling.
hmm
Right out of the gate, Kirsch just lays it out there. He says that a huge chunk of what we think antidepressants do might just be the placebo effect.
Okay, so to unpack that, can we talk a bit about how new drugs, like antidepressants, actually get approved? I mean, there's got to be a process, right?
Right. So typically there are rigorous clinical trials. You have two groups. Some get the actual drug and others get a placebo. And the drug can only be approved if it works significantly better than the placebo.
Makes sense. So where do things get murky?
Well, Kirsch analyzed 38 different clinical trials. We're talking over 3,000 patients here. And what he found is that the difference in improvement between the drug and placebo groups, well, it was way smaller than you expect.
So some people taking the placebo were seeing nearly the same benefit as those on the real medication.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. Kirsch found that a surprisingly large number of participants could actually tell if they were on the real drug or the placebo.
How could they tell? Were there like clues or something?
Side effects. The group getting the actual meds were more likely to report things like dry mouth, nausea, the typical side effects, while the placebo group obviously didn't have those.
So they knew they were getting the real deal, so to speak, and maybe that belief made the placebo effect even stronger.
Exactly. It's like their belief in the treatment, fueled by the presence of those side effects, became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow, so it's not just about the drug itself, but the whole experience surrounding it.
Precisely. And Kirsch found a similar pattern when he, along with other researchers, analyzed data on a specific SSRI, Seroxat. They factored in the differences in side effects between the drug and placebo groups, and guess what? No statistically significant difference in improvement rates.
Hold on. If that's true, how did these antidepressants even get approved in the first place?
It's the million-dollar question. And what's more, Kirsch found that regulatory agencies like the FDA, they knew about the unpublished data that showed many antidepressant trials didn't really show much benefit over placebos.
So they knew, but they still approved them. That seems, well, kind of shady.
It certainly raises questions, and it gets worse. There's this practice called salami slicing. It's where drug companies basically take their data and only publish the good bits, the positive results, to make their drugs seem more effective.
Ah, so it's like selectively presenting information to paint a rosier picture than what's really there.
Precisely. And Kirsch argues that this practice, combined with the whole suppressing negative findings thing, has massively skewed how we understand antidepressants.
That's incredibly concerning. So we've got potentially misleading data and unpublished studies that might tell a different story. What does this mean for patients?
Well, it means that many people are making decisions about their mental health based on incomplete information, and that's a problem.
It certainly seems like it. But what about the argument that antidepressants are more effective for people with severe depression? Maybe the impact is more noticeable in those cases.
That's a common argument, but Kirsch tackled that head on. He looked at the data, both published and unpublished, from the FDA, and found absolutely no evidence that the severity of depression actually influenced how well antidepressants worked, or didn't work, as the case may be.
Okay, so even for people experiencing severe depression, the benefit over placebo was negligible.
Exactly. The minimal benefit, if you can even call it that, remained pretty much the same, regardless of how depressed a person was.
So another commonly held belief debunked. But what about the chemical imbalance theory? That's often given as an explanation for why people experience depression in the first place.
Yeah, the idea that depression is simply a matter of chemical imbalance, it's pervasive. But Kirsch argues that this theory is actually based on the assumed effectiveness of antidepressants, not the other way around.
Wait, so they saw that antidepressants seemed to be working and then created a theory to explain why, but the initial premise that antidepressants are effective might be flawed from the start.
It sounds like they got things backward. And there's more. This chemical imbalance theory, it was linked to a drug called rizerpine. Initially, they thought rizerpine caused depression, but later, controlled studies found that it could actually alleviate depression.
So another strike against the chemical imbalance theory. It's like the evidence just keeps piling up against it.
Right, and it gets even more interesting. Later studies intentionally reduced serotonin and norepinephrine levels in healthy volunteers.
And those are the neurotransmitters that are supposedly out of whack in depression, right?
Exactly. They were trying to create a chemical imbalance to see if it would actually trigger
Did
depression.
it work?
Nope. They couldn't induce depression just by messing with those neurotransmitter levels. It really suggests that depression is far more complex than just a chemical imbalance in the brain.
So if it's not just a chemical imbalance, then what's going on? What does Kirsch say about all of this?
Well, he suggests that maybe, just maybe, we're too quick to medicalize complex human emotions like sadness, grief, the things that are a part of life.
Instead of just accepting these emotions as part of the human experience, we jump to labeling them as disorders that require medication.
That's the idea he's putting forward, and he brings up the placebo effect, which we talked about earlier, as a prime example.
It's easy to dismiss the placebo effect as just, people fooling themselves. But Kirsch really dives into the science behind it, and it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. Studies have shown that placebos can cause actual measurable changes in the brain and body, not just subjective feelings.
So it's not just in people's heads. It's like their beliefs are actually influencing their physical reality.
In a way, yes. Kirsch talks about a study on angina, which is a painful heart condition, and they gave some patients a placebo and others the actual medication.
What happened?
Both groups showed significant improvement. The placebo was nearly as effective as the real drug just because people believed they were getting effective treatment.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So even in a serious physical condition like angina, the power of belief can have a real impact.
It seems so, and it's not limited to physical conditions. There's another study Kirsch mentions where they gave people a drug to deliberately make them nauseous. Then some got a placebo, but were told it was an anti-nausea medication.
So they were basically tricked into thinking they were getting something to relieve the nausea that the researchers had intentionally caused. It's kind of mean.
Well, it was for science. But the interesting thing is, the placebo worked. The people who took it reported significantly less nausea, and even their physical responses, like their gastric contractions, returned to normal.
It's like their bodies responded to what their minds were expecting, even though they were still technically under the influence of this nausea-inducing drug.
The mind-body connection is a powerful thing. And on the flip side, Kirsch also talks about the nocebo effect, where negative expectations lead to negative experiences.
So, like, if you're convinced something is going to make you feel worse, you're more likely to actually experience those negative effects.
Precisely. There was a study on insomniacs. They were all given a placebo pill, but half were told it would make them more alert, and the other half were told it would help them relax.
Sneaky. So what happened?
The people who thought the pill would make them alert actually fell asleep faster, while the group expecting relaxation took longer to fall asleep.
Wow. It's amazing how much our expectations can shape our experiences, even when it comes to something as basic as sleep.
And Kirsch suggests that this might be happening with depression, too. He talks about the work of Aaron Beck, who pioneered cognitive therapy.
Cognitive therapy, that's about changing your thought patterns, right?
Exactly. Beck argued that our thoughts and interpretations of events, they play a huge role in our emotions, including whether we feel depressed or not.
So, like if you're constantly thinking negative thoughts like I'm a failure or nothing good ever happens to me, those thoughts can actually contribute to feeling depressed.
That's the idea, and it challenges that whole chemical imbalance theory. Kirsch is suggesting that our thought patterns, our beliefs, our social context, they matter more than we might realize.
It's not just about what's happening in our brains chemically, but also what's happening in our minds and in our lives.
And if our thoughts can influence our experience of depression, then it stands to reason that changing those thoughts could be a powerful tool for healing, right?
Makes sense to me. And that brings us to therapies like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which I know Kirsch is a big proponent of.
Kirsch really emphasizes that CBT is not just about masking symptoms. It's about equipping people with skills and insights to create lasting change.
So it's not a Band-Aid. It's more like learning how to manage your thoughts and emotions in a healthier way.
Exactly. CBT helps people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
And does it work?
The research is pretty compelling. Kirsch points out that CBT can significantly reduce the risk of depression relapse, even years after treatment has ended, which is something antidepressants can struggle with.
That's a big deal because with antidepressants, people often end up taking them long-term to prevent relapse, which can come with its own set of challenges.
Right, and Kirsch doesn't just stop at CBT. He explores other alternatives too, like exercise even bibliotherapy.
Bibliotherapy, that sounds interesting. What's that all about?
It's basically using books as therapy.
So you're saying reading a book could actually help alleviate symptoms of depression? I mean,
know.
I love to read, but that's wild.
The research suggests it's possible, especially for people who might not have access to traditional therapy or prefer a more self-guided approach.
But I know Kirsch doesn't just focus on individual solutions. He also talks about the bigger picture, the societal factors that contribute to depression.
Absolutely. He argues that we can't ignore the social context when we're talking about mental health. He points to tons of research linking things like poverty, unemployment, social inequality, all of that, to a higher risk of depression.
So it's not just about individual factors like genetics or personality. It's about the environments we live in and the systemic issues that create stress and hopelessness.
Exactly. And Kirsch argues that we often individualize what are actually societal problems. We try to fix individuals without addressing the underlying issues that are contributing to their distress.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. Are we, as a society, using medication to mask larger systemic problems that need to be addressed?
It's a question worth considering, and this is where Kirsch really starts to dig into the role of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry, they have a huge influence on how we think about and treat mental health. It's a conversation we can't shy away from.
Absolutely, and Kirsch doesn't hold back. He's very upfront about the fact that drug companies, well, they're businesses. Their primary goal is profit, and that creates a conflict of interest when it comes to presenting their products in an objective light.
Right, because they're incentivized to make their drugs seem as effective as possible, whether they actually are or not.
Exactly, and Kirsch's research uncovered some pretty concerning practices. We already talked about salami slicing, which is bad enough, but it goes deeper than that. He found evidence of outright suppression of negative data. He looked at data from the FDA, both published and unpublished, and it turned out that a bunch of trials, ones where antidepressants didn't outperform placebos, those just never saw the light of day.
Wow, so it's not just about highlighting the positives. It's about actively burying the negatives. That's a whole other level of messed up.
It really undermines the whole system, doesn't it? I mean, doctors and patients rely on this information to make informed decisions about treatment, and if they're only seeing a carefully curated sliver of the whole picture.
It's incredibly misleading, and it also stifles innovation, right?
Yeah.
If the focus is on pushing these drugs that have questionable efficacy, then who's going to invest in researching and developing alternative treatments?
That's a really important point. This lack of transparency could be holding back progress in mental health care. And it's not just the pharmaceutical companies that share some responsibility here. Kirsch also takes aim at regulatory agencies like the FDA.
The FDA, I mean, they're supposed to be the watchdogs, right?
Yeah.
Making sure that drugs are safe and effective before they hit the market.
That's the idea. But Kirsch found that even the FDA was aware of this unpublished data that showed the limited effectiveness of antidepressants.
They knew. And they still approve these drugs.
It seems like it. Which raises serious questions about how these decisions are made and whose interests are really being served. Kirsch points to the financial ties between the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory bodies like the FDA as a potential source of bias.
It's a classic case of follow the money, right? It's hard to claim impartiality when there's so much financial entanglement. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Kirsch's work, it's clear that he's raising some serious questions about antidepressants. But I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't about demonizing medication or telling people what to do with their mental health. It's about empowering.
Absolutely. If you're taking antidepressants and if you're not seeing the results you expected, or if you're having second thoughts, it's crucial to talk to your doctor. Have an open and honest conversation about your options. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right. And remember, there are other options out there. CBT, exercise, even bibliotherapy. Kirsch presents a whole range of alternatives that deserve consideration. Don't feel trapped into thinking that medication is the only answer.
Exactly.
Kirsch wants us to think critically about the information we're given, to question assumptions, and to be active participants in our own mental health journeys.
It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and that the journey to mental well-being is often complex and multifaceted.
It's about understanding the power of the placebo effect, the limitations of current research, and the undeniable influence of social and economic factors on our mental health.
And perhaps most importantly, it's about moving beyond the quick-fix mentality and embracing a more compassionate approach to mental health.
Well said. To our listeners, we encourage you to check out Kirsch's book, The Emperor's New Drugs, and delve into the research for yourselves. knowledge is power, and the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to advocate for a mental health care system that truly serves everyone.